August 16th, 1854. 11 a.m. on the slopes above the Alma River in Crimea. Captain Pavel Krylev of the Vladimir Regiment stood behind the stone wall with his 840 men, watching the British infantry form their lines in the valley below. The 33-year-old veteran of the Caucasus campaigns felt confident. His regiment held the high ground. His men were disciplined troops who had trained in the same tactics that had crushed Napoleon's Grande Armée 42 years earlier. The British would advance in their traditional close-order formations, his artillery would tear holes in their ranks, and then Russian musketry would finish the job at 50 yards. This was how infantry combat had worked for 150 years. What Krylev didn't know, what no Russian commander on that ridge understood, was that the rules of warfare had fundamentally changed. The British soldiers forming ranks 300 yards away were carrying Enfield rifles loaded with a new type of projectile, a conical lead bullet with a hollow base invented by a French army captain named Claude-Étienne Minié. This seemingly simple innovation, a soft lead bullet that expanded when fired, was about to render obsolete every tactical doctrine that European armies had developed since the pike and musket era. Within 20 minutes, Krylev's regiment would be shattered. Within 2 hours, Russian casualties would exceed 5,000 men. Within a decade, every army in the world would be forced to abandon the massed formations, bayonet charges, and close-order tactics that had dominated warfare since the 17th century. The Minié ball didn't just change how battles were fought, it made traditional combat impossible. This is the story of how a hollow bullet destroyed 200 years of a military doctrine, turned defensive positions into death traps, made cavalry charges suicidal, and forced armies to learn new ways of killing each other. It's about how technology can render experience worthless, how innovation creates chaos, and how thousands of men died because their commanders refused to accept that warfare had changed forever. To understand what the Minié ball destroyed, you need to understand what came before it. The smooth-bore musket had dominated European warfare since the late 1600s. The standard infantry weapon, whether it was the British Brown Bess, the French Charleville, or the Russian Model 1828, was essentially the same design. A smooth metal tube, a flintlock or percussion cap firing mechanism, and a spherical lead ball that was slightly smaller than the barrel's diameter. These weapons were terrifyingly inaccurate. A trained soldier could hit a man-sized target at 50 yards maybe half the time. At 100 yards, accuracy dropped to perhaps 1 in 10. At 200 yards, you might as well throw rocks. The problem was fundamental physics. The spherical ball would bounce down the barrel as it was fired, exiting at unpredictable angles. Wind resistance acted on the sphere chaotically. There was no spin to stabilize the projectile. A musket wasn't aimed so much as pointed in the general direction of the enemy. But armies had learned to make this inaccuracy work through tactics. If individual muskets were wildly inaccurate, the solution was to mass hundreds of muskets together and fire them simultaneously. The British developed 2-rank firing lines, 200 men shoulder to shoulder, creating a wall of lead 100 yards wide. The French preferred 3-rank columns that could maneuver quickly and deploy into line. The Russians used massive columns of battalion strength, 800 men in tight formation designed to smash through enemy lines through sheer mass. All of these tactics depended on one crucial factor. The engagement range was so short that battles were decided by discipline, courage, and cold steel, not marksmanship. Armies would maneuver to within 100 yards, exchange a few devastating volleys that killed perhaps 10% of each formation, and then one side would either break and run or fix bayonets and charge into close combat. The side with better morale, tighter formations, and more aggressive officers usually won. This system worked for nearly 2 centuries. It worked at Blenheim in 1704, at Fontenoy in 1745, at Minden in 1759. It reached its apex during the Napoleonic Wars, when European armies fielded hundreds of thousands of men trained to stand in dense formations and trade volleys at ranges where you could see the expression on your enemy's face. Wellington's thin red line at Waterloo, Napoleon's columns at Austerlitz, the Russian masses at Borodino, all fought the same way. March to within musket range, pour fire into each other for 10 to 15 minutes, then charge with the bayonet. Officers understood that casualties would be horrific. Napoleonic battles routinely killed 20 to 30% of engaged forces, but the tactics made sense given the weapons. Dense formations maximized firepower while minimizing the frontage that enemy fire could target. Tight unit cohesion prevented panic and rout. Close-order drill created the discipline needed to stand and fire while men dropped around you. The entire system, from training to tactics to battlefield doctrine, was optimized for weapons effective only at extremely close range. But there was another weapon that armies knew about but couldn't adopt: the rifle. Rifling spiral grooves cut into a gun barrel that made the projectile spin had been known since the 15th century. Rifles were magnificently accurate compared to muskets. A good rifleman could hit a man at 300 yards consistently. But rifles had a fatal flaw for military use. Loading them was agonizingly slow. The rifle bullet had to fit tightly into the grooves to engage the rifling and gain spin. This meant it had to be hammered down the barrel with a mallet and ramrod, a process that took 2 to 3 minutes per shot. A musket could be loaded and fired 3 to 4 times per minute, because the undersized ball dropped easily down the smooth bore. In a pitched battle where volume of fire mattered more than individual accuracy, rifles were useless. Rifle-armed troops would get off one shot before musket-armed infantry overran them with the bayonet. Armies did use rifles in limited roles. British rifle regiments armed with the Baker rifle served as skirmishers during the Napoleonic Wars, picking off officers and disrupting enemy formations. American riflemen had used the Kentucky long rifle to devastating effect during the Revolution, though they too were vulnerable to bayonet charges. But these were specialist troops. The bulk of every army carried smoothbore muskets because tactical doctrine required rapid fire, not accuracy. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Captain Claude-Étienne Minié of the French army was an instructor at the Vincennes shooting school in the late 1840s. He was experimenting with ways to make rifles practical for regular infantry when he developed a deceptively simple solution. Instead of using a spherical ball, Minie designed a conical bullet with a hollow base. The bullet was slightly smaller than the rifle bore, so it could be loaded as quickly as a musket ball. But when the gunpowder exploded, the hot gases expanded the soft lead base, forcing it into the rifling grooves. The result was revolutionary. A rifle loaded with a Minié ball could be fired as fast as a musket, but with the accuracy of a rifle. A soldier could load and fire 3 rounds per minute while hitting man-sized targets at 300 to 400 yards consistently. Some marksmen demonstrated accuracy out to 800 yards, ranges at which smoothbore muskets couldn't even reach the target. The French army adopted the Minié ball in 1849. The British, always suspicious of French innovations, tested it extensively before introducing their own version with the Enfield rifle in 1853. The Americans, with their frontier tradition of rifle shooting, immediately recognized its potential. By 1855, every major army in Europe was either adopting rifles and Minié balls or desperately trying to. The implications were staggering, but very few officers understood them at first. To military traditionalists, rifles were just more accurate muskets. They thought tactics might need slight modifications, perhaps extending the engagement range by 50 yards or so. But the fundamental nature of infantry combat would remain the same. Dense formations, disciplined volleys, bayonet charges. They were catastrophically wrong. The Battle of the Alma demonstrated the new reality with brutal clarity. British infantry advanced in their traditional 2-rank lines, but they opened fire at 300 yards, 3 times the effective range of smoothbore muskets. Russian artillery, positioned to tear apart formations at 100 to 150 yards, found themselves under accurate rifle fire before they could effectively engage. Russian infantry, trained to absorb casualties during the approach march and then close to effective musket range, were being torn apart before they could fire a shot. Captain Krulev watched in disbelief as men began falling at ranges he considered safe. The British weren't even in proper musket range, yet his soldiers were dropping as if struck by artillery. He ordered his men to hold fire, waiting for the enemy to close, but the British didn't close. They stopped at 250 yards and began firing disciplined volleys. Krulev's men, unable to effectively return fire at that distance, could only stand and die or break ranks and charge into the devastating fire. Russian accounts from survivors described the nightmare. The British seemed to be firing from impossible distances. Men would fall with precise shots to the head and chest. Officers, identifiable by their uniforms and positions, were targeted specifically. Artillery crews were picked off one by one before they could properly serve their guns. The traditional Russian tactic of absorbing casualties and closing with the bayonet became impossible because the casualties became unbearable before bayonet range was ever reached. British casualties at the Alma were roughly 2,000. Russian casualties exceeded 5,000, with some regiments losing over 40% of their strength. This wasn't the traditional bloody but balanced exchange of Napoleonic warfare, where both sides took roughly equal losses in close-range firefights. This was systematic slaughter. One side stood at range and fired, while the other couldn't effectively return fire. But the Crimean War was in a distant theatre, and many European military observers dismissed the results as anomalies. The Russians were poorly led, they said. The British had superior morale and discipline. Surely the traditional tactics would still work in a European war between first-rate powers. They would be proven horribly wrong in 1861 when the American Civil War erupted, and both sides were armed with rifles and Minié balls. The Civil War became a 4-year demonstration of what happened when armies armed with rifled weapons tried to fight using Napoleonic tactics. The results were almost unbelievably bloody. The war produced casualty rates that wouldn't be seen again until World War I, and for the same reason. Offensive tactics had not caught up with defensive firepower. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862 became the textbook example of obsolete tactics meeting modern weapons. Union General Ambrose Burnside ordered frontal assaults against Confederate positions on Mary's Heights. The Confederates held a stone wall at the base of the heights, with infantry in ranks 4 deep, allowing continuous fire. Behind them, more infantry and artillery covered the approaches. Union troops had to cross 400 yards of open ground to reach Confederate positions. In the Napoleonic era, with smoothbore muskets, such an assault was dangerous but feasible. Attacking infantry might lose 15 to 20% of their strength during the approach, then close for a firefight and bayonet charge. At Fredericksburg, with both sides armed with rifles firing Minié balls, so the 400-yard approach became a killing ground. Confederate soldiers later described it as murder, not combat. Union formations would emerge from Fredericksburg town and begin their advance. Confederate riflemen would open fire at 300 yards and maintain continuous fire as the Union troops advanced. Men fell in rows. Officers were specifically targeted and killed. Colour bearers, the soldiers carrying the regimental flags that served as rallying points, were shot down repeatedly. Survivors described walking over carpets of bodies from previous assault waves. Not a single Union formation reached the stone wall. 14 separate assaults were launched. Each one was torn apart by rifle fire before closing to bayonet range. Union casualties exceeded 12,600 men. Confederate casualties were roughly 5,000, and most of those were from Union artillery fire, not infantry action. The ratio of losses in the infantry assault was closer to 8 to 1. One Confederate soldier wrote in his diary that night, "We shot them down like dogs. There was no fight in it, just execution. They kept coming and we kept killing them. How much courage does it take to pull a trigger at men walking toward you? How much courage does it take to walk toward men shooting at you? I don't know who was braver, but I know who was more foolish." Gettysburg in July 1863 provided another lesson in the new reality. Pickett's charge, the Confederate assault on the Union center on July 3rd, was conceived as a classic Napoleonic attack. 12,500 men in tight formations would cross 3/4 of a mile of open ground, overwhelm the Union defenders with shock and mass, and break the Union line. General James Longstreet, Lee's most experienced corps commander, looked at the ground his men would have to cross and reportedly told Lee, "General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Longstreet was right. The Confederate infantry advanced in magnificent order, parade ground precision, the old way. Union artillery opened up at 400 yards with solid shot and shell. At 1,000 yards, they switched to case shot. At 600 yards, Union infantry behind stone walls began firing. At 400 yards, the Union infantry fire became general all along the line. At 200 yards, canister from artillery joined the rifle fire, essentially turning cannons into giant shotguns firing hundreds of metal balls. The Confederate formations disintegrated, not because the men broke and ran, but because there was no one left standing. Units that began the charge with 800 men arrived at the Union lines with 100. A few hundred Confederates actually reached the stone wall, fought hand-to-hand briefly, and then died or surrendered. Of the 12,500 men who began the charge, roughly 6,500 became casualties in less than 30 minutes. That's over 50% casualties. Some regiments lost 75% of their strength, but these battles, horrific as they were, occurred in America. European observers watched with interest, but still believed their armies were different, better trained, more disciplined. Surely professional European soldiers wouldn't make the same mistakes as American volunteers. This delusion persisted until the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, and especially the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when European armies discovered firsthand that the Minié ball had destroyed their entire tactical system. The Battle of Königgrätz in July 1866 pitted the Austrian army, still largely trained in Napoleonic tactics, against the Prussian army, which had begun adapting to rifled weapons. The Austrians advanced in their traditional dense columns, expecting to close with the Prussians and decide the battle with the bayonet. Instead, they were shredded by Prussian rifle fire at ranges the Austrians considered safe. Austrian casualties were 44,000 out of 215,000 engaged. Prussian casualties were 9,000 out of 221,000. This wasn't a battle. It was systematic destruction of one army by another. Austrian officers, trained in the old ways, kept ordering charges that accomplished nothing except adding to the body count. One Austrian regimental commander, surveying his shattered unit after a failed assault, reportedly said, "We charged as our fathers and grandfathers charged. Why did it not work?" The answer was simple. His fathers and grandfathers had charged against smoothbore muskets effective at 50 to 100 yards. He was charging against rifles effective at 400 to 600 yards. The 300 to 500 yards of additional killing range meant that attacking infantry was under fire for 3 to 5 times as long during their approach. Casualty rates didn't increase linearly, they increased exponentially. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 drove the lesson home with even greater force. The French army, which had invented the Minié ball and adopted rifled weapons earlier than most European powers, discovered that having modern weapons didn't help if you still used obsolete tactics. The French favoured headlong assaults, the élan and offensive spirit that French military culture had celebrated since Napoleon. At the Battle of Marly-la-Tour in August 1870, French infantry repeatedly charged Prussian positions across open ground. At the Battle of Gravelotte 2 days later, they did it again. Each time, the results were the same. French formations would advance in good order, Prussian rifles would open fire at 400 to 500 yards, and the French would be decimated before closing to effective range. French casualties in these two battles exceeded 25,000. Prussian casualties were roughly 16,000, and many of those were from the few successful French artillery strikes. But the truly stunning demonstration came at the Battle of Sedan in September 1870. The French army, approximately 120,000 strong, was surrounded in the fortress city of Sedan. The Prussians, rather than storming the city, simply positioned their artillery and riflemen around it and began systematic destruction. French attempts to break out were shattered by rifle fire. French positions inside the city were pounded by artillery. After 1 day of this, Emperor Napoleon III, commanding the French army personally, surrendered the entire force. European military observers finally understood. The combination of rifled weapons and Minié balls had made traditional offensive tactics obsolete. The attacking force would always suffer disproportionate casualties because they were under effective fire for the entire approach distance, while the defenders could remain in cover and fire without exposing themselves. The numbers told the story. In Napoleonic battles, casualty ratios between attacker and defender were typically 1.5 to 1 or 2 to 1. In Civil War and Franco-Prussian War battles, casualty ratios frequently reached 3 to 1, 4 to 1, or even higher. The attacker simply couldn't survive the approach to bayonet range anymore. But the Minié ball didn't just change infantry tactics. It destroyed the effectiveness of cavalry and fundamentally altered the role of artillery. Cavalry had been the queen of the battlefield since ancient times. Heavy cavalry charges had decided battles throughout history. During the Napoleonic era, massed cavalry charges against infantry squares had been dramatic, often decisive actions. The infantry square, a formation where soldiers faced outward in all directions with bayonets presented, could usually stop a cavalry charge. But cavalry could still threaten flanks, pursue broken formations, and occasionally break poorly trained or weakened infantry. Cavalry charges against infantry armed with rifles firing Minié balls became suicide. The effective range of infantry fire meant that cavalry had to gallop 300 to 400 yards under fire before reaching the enemy line. Horses were large targets. A cavalry formation moving at 20 to 25 miles per hour covered maybe 30 yards per second. That meant cavalry was under effective fire for 10 to 15 seconds during their approach, time enough for defending infantry to fire 3 to 4 aimed volleys. The Battle of Balaclava in October 1854 demonstrated this brutally during the Crimean War. The famous charge of the Light Brigade saw 670 British cavalrymen charge Russian positions defended by artillery and infantry. The Light Brigade was supposed to charge artillery positions, but miscommunication sent them down a valley flanked by Russian riflemen. The results were predictable. Russian infantry poured fire into the British cavalry from both sides. Artillery fired into them from the front. Of 670 men, 118 were killed and 127 wounded in less than 20 minutes. The survivors reached the Russian guns, fought briefly, and then had to retreat back through the same gauntlet of fire. The charge of the Light Brigade became famous because of the courage involved, but military analysts recognized it as proof that cavalry could no longer charge prepared infantry. Lord Raglan, the British commander, supposedly said afterward, "Cavalry is finished. They cannot survive the approach to modern infantry positions." During the Civil War, cavalry continued to serve in reconnaissance, screening and raiding roles, but classical cavalry charges against infantry became increasingly rare. When they did occur, the results were horrific. At the Battle of Gaines' Mill in June 1862, Confederate cavalry attempted to charge Union infantry positions. The cavalry was shredded, losing over 40% of their strength in the first minutes. Confederate commanders rarely tried such attacks again. By the Franco-Prussian War, European cavalry had largely accepted their diminished role. The days of massed cavalry charges deciding battles were over. Cavalry became scouts, messengers, and pursuit forces rather than shock troops. The Minié Bull had removed one of the three traditional arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, from decisive battlefield roles. Artillery faced its own crisis. Napoleonic artillery tactics relied on positioning guns 300 to 600 yards from enemy lines and pounding them with solid shot and canister. This was effective because enemy infantry couldn't engage the artillery effectively at those ranges with smoothbore muskets. Artillery crews could work their guns in relative safety, protected by infantry support and distance. Rifles changed everything. Artillery positioned 300 to 600 yards from enemy infantry was now in effective rifle range. Gunners serving their pieces could be picked off by riflemen. Horses, essential for moving artillery, became easy targets. Ammunition handlers, officers directing fire, all became vulnerable to aimed rifle fire. At the Battle of the Alma, Russian artillery positioned 400 yards from British lines expecting to devastate the British formations, with canister found themselves under accurate rifle fire. Gun crews were shot down, officers were killed, horses were targeted, immobilizing the guns. The artillery was forced to either withdraw to longer ranges where their solid shot was less effective, or stay in place and be destroyed by rifle fire. During the Civil War, artillery learned to position further from enemy lines, typically 800 to 1,000 yards, where they were safer from rifle fire but less effective against infantry. This created a deadly gap. Infantry couldn't advance across open ground without being torn apart by rifle fire, but artillery couldn't get close enough to suppress the defending infantry effectively. The result was stalemate in many battles, with neither side able to achieve decisive results without suffering catastrophic casualties. The tactical problem armies faced was fundamental. Defence had become enormously more powerful than offence. An entrenched defender with a rifle could kill an attacker at 400 yards. The attacker had to advance those 400 yards, under fire before being able to return fire effectively. Simple mathematics made offensive operations nearly impossible against prepared positions. Some commanders recognized this and began adapting. At the Battle of Cold Harbor in June 1864, Union General Ulysses Grant ordered frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions. The attacks failed catastrophically, with Union forces suffering 7,000 casualties in less than 1 hour, many in the first 8 minutes. Grant later wrote in his memoirs, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. No advantage whatever was gained to compensate for the heavy loss we sustained. Confederate General Robert E. Lee understood the power of defensive positions. After Cold Harbor, Lee's army entrenched extensively whenever they stopped moving. Lee recognized that his smaller army could inflict disproportionate casualties on Union forces if they fought from prepared positions. The last year of the Civil War in Virginia became a siege warfare, with both armies dug into increasingly sophisticated trench systems around Petersburg and Richmond. But even as some commanders learned, many others didn't. The military culture of most European armies celebrated offensive action, aggressive assault, and decisive battle. Defensive fighting was considered unsoldierly. The French army, in particular, maintained an almost religious devotion to offensive spirit. French military theory in the late 19th century emphasized morale, courage, and aggressive attack as the keys to victory. This would have catastrophic consequences in 1914 when World War I began. But that's getting ahead of our story. In the 1860s and 1870s, armies were still grappling with the immediate implications of rifled weapons. Some lessons were learned. Infantry formations became more dispersed. The dense columns of Napoleonic warfare gave way to extended lines with more space between soldiers. Skirmish lines, loose formations of soldiers taking advantage of cover, became standard. Entrenchments became common. Soldiers learned to dig in whenever they stopped moving. Field fortifications, previously used mainly in siege warfare, became standard practice in mobile operations. By the end of the Civil War, armies were routinely entrenching positions with elaborate systems of trenches, earthworks, and obstacles. Tactical movement changed. Infantry learned to advance by rushes, small groups moving forward, while others provided covering fire rather than advancing in formation. The traditional parade ground precision of Napoleonic tactics gave way to more fluid, flexible methods. But these adaptations were incomplete and often resisted by traditional officers. Many European military leaders viewed the American Civil War as an aberration, a conflict fought by amateurs who didn't understand proper military science. They believed that European professional armies wouldn't make the same mistakes. This was wishful thinking born of institutional arrogance. The Minié ball had created a fundamental problem that wouldn't be solved until World War I. Defensive firepower had increased dramatically, but offensive capabilities had not kept pace. There was no way for attacking infantry to suppress defending riflemen effectively. Artillery couldn't get close enough to provide direct support. Cavalry couldn't charge infantry. The attacker had no answer to defenders firing from cover at long range. Some technological solutions were attempted. Breech-loading rifles, which could be loaded much faster than muzzle loaders, became common in the 1870s and 1880s. Magazine rifles, holding multiple rounds, appeared in the 1880s. Machine guns were developed, though their full potential wasn't understood until World War I. But none of these innovations solved the fundamental problem. They actually made it worse by increasing defensive firepower even more. The social implications were staggering. Warfare had always been bloody, but the industrial age combined with rifled weapons created casualty rates that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. The American Civil War killed roughly 620,000 soldiers out of a combined population of 31 million. That's 2% of the total population dead in 4 years. The Franco-Prussian War killed roughly 184,000 in less than a year. These weren't just statistics. They were fathers, sons, brothers, all killed by a technology that military doctrine hadn't adapted to. Letters from soldiers in these conflicts reveal the horror. A Confederate soldier wrote in 1864, "We don't fight battles anymore. We murder each other from holes in the ground. There is no glory in this, only death." A French soldier wrote after Gravelotte, "We charged as heroes. We died as fools. The Prussians stayed behind their walls and shot us like targets at a fair. Our officers still speak of honour and courage. What honour is there in walking into gunfire that you cannot return? What courage when the alternative is being shot for cowardice?" The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers in earlier wars had faced death at close range, but combat was brief and decisive. A Napoleonic battle might last a day, with the critical action occurring in 1 to 2 hours. Soldiers endured short periods of extreme danger, then the battle was over. Civil War battles could last for days, with soldiers under constant fire, unable to sleep, eating when they could, living in trenches filling with water and waste. Combat became an endurance test as much as a test of courage. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, became common enough to be recognized as a distinct medical condition. Soldiers broke mentally from the sustained stress of being under fire for extended periods. The Confederate Army by 1864 was suffering from widespread demoralization, not because soldiers lacked courage, but because they understood the mathematics of destruction and knew that survival was largely random chance. But perhaps the most significant impact was on military thinking. The generation of officers who fought in the Civil War and Franco-Prussian War learned powerful lessons about modern warfare. They understood that frontal assaults against prepared positions were suicide. They knew that defensive firepower had become overwhelming. They recognized that tactics had to change. Unfortunately, many of these officers retired or died before World War I. The officers who commanded armies in 1914 had mostly learned their profession in colonial wars against poorly armed opponents. They believed that European elan and discipline could overcome any defensive fire. They were wrong, and millions would die proving it. The Minié legacy extended far beyond the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. It fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. Combat shifted from brief, decisive battles to prolonged campaigns of attrition. Victory went not to the most courageous or tactically brilliant, but to whoever could sustain casualties longer. Industrial capacity and population became more important than military skill. The weapons that dominated World War I, machine guns, artillery, barbed wire, trenches, were all responses to the problem the Minié created. How do you attack an enemy armed with rapid-fire weapons who can kill you at long range? The answer, discovered over 4 years and millions of casualties, involved tanks, aircraft, sophisticated artillery barrages, infiltration tactics, and combined arms coordination. But even then, offensive operations remained costly and difficult. Military historians often focus on famous generals, brilliant strategies, and decisive battles. But sometimes technology matters more than genius. The Minié ball, a hollow lead bullet invented by a French captain, did more to change warfare than Napoleon, Lee, Grant and Moltke combined. It made their preferred tactics obsolete and forced armies to learn new ways of fighting, or die trying. At Gettysburg National Military Park, there's a monument to the 1st Minnesota Infantry Regiment. This regiment, roughly 260 men, was ordered to charge a Confederate formation of 1,200 men on July 2, 1863. The charge was meant to buy time for Union reinforcements to arrive. The Minnesotans advanced across open ground into rifle fire from superior numbers. 82% of the regiment became casualties in less than 5 minutes. Of 260 men, only 47 were still standing when the charge was over. The monument honours their courage, and rightfully so. But there's another lesson there. 215 men died or were wounded because military doctrine hadn't caught up with weapons technology. They were ordered to make an attack that might have succeeded in 1815 but was suicide in 1863. Their sacrifice bought time and potentially saved the Union line from collapsing. But it shouldn't have been necessary. With modern understanding, the same objective could have been achieved with far fewer casualties. That's the real legacy of the Minié ball. It exposed the terrible gap between technological change and tactical adaptation. It demonstrated that courage and discipline couldn't overcome firepower. It proved that armies led by tradition rather than innovation would suffer horrific casualties. These lessons would have to be relearned in World War I, Korea and Vietnam, each time at tremendous human cost. Captain Krylev, the Russian officer standing on the Alma heights in August 1854, survived the battle. He was wounded twice but lived to fight in the siege of Sevastopol. In his memoirs, published years later, he wrote about that day. "We thought we understood war. We had studied Napoleon's campaigns. We knew how battles were fought. But standing on that ridge, watching my men fall to fire from distances I thought were safe, I realized our knowledge was obsolete. The British weren't better soldiers. They weren't braver or more disciplined. They simply had weapons that made our tactics useless. I learned then that in war, technology defeats tradition. I learned it with the blood of my men." The hollow lead bullet that Captain Claude-Étienne Minié invented in the late 1840s was a simple thing. Soft lead, conical shape, hollow base. It weighed less than an ounce. It cost almost nothing to produce, but it killed hundreds of thousands of men and destroyed centuries of military tradition. It proved that sometimes the smallest innovations have the largest consequences, and it taught armies, slowly and bloodily, that tactics based on yesterday's weapons will only get soldiers killed by today's technology. The thunder of massed musketry at 50 yards, the sound that had dominated battlefields for 150 years, was replaced by the crack of rifles at 400 yards. The bayonet charge, the decisive moment of infantry combat since Roman times, became a desperate last resort rather than a standard tactic. The cavalry charge, the embodiment of military glory and aristocratic warfare, became a death sentence. Everything changed because a bullet's shape changed. That's the power of technology. That's the lesson of the Minié ball. By the 1880s, European armies had theoretically learned from the disasters of the 1860s and 1870s. Military academies taught that frontal assaults against prepared positions were futile. Staff colleges emphasized the importance of cover, dispersion, and combined arms tactics, but theory and practice diverged dramatically. The institutional culture of most European armies, particularly the French, remained wedded to offensive doctrine. The belief persisted that superior morale and aggressive spirit could overcome defensive firepower. This wasn't just stubbornness, it reflected genuine strategic problems that armies faced. In an era of mass conscription and railway mobilization, wars would be decided quickly. The side that remained defensive would cede the initiative and potentially lose strategically even while winning tactically. France, surrounded by potential enemies and, traumatized by the disaster of 1870, became obsessed with offensive action. French military doctrine by 1900 emphasized l'offensive à outrance, offense to the utmost. Attack always, attack everywhere, attack with maximum energy and will. French military theorists like Colonel Louis de Grandmaison taught that firepower's effects could be overcome through moral force. He wrote extensively about how troops imbued with offensive spirit could advance through modern firepower. His theories became official doctrine. French infantry regulations by 1913 stated that infantry should advance in dense formations, maintaining cohesion and momentum. The regulations acknowledged that casualties would be heavy during the approach, but insisted that vigorous bayonet charges would decide battles. This was madness, but it was madness born of strategic desperation mixed with technological optimism. Some French officers believed that new weapons like the 75 mm quick-firing artillery piece would suppress defensive fire enough to allow infantry to close. Others believed that faster mobilization would allow France to invade Germany before German defenses were fully prepared. Few were willing to accept the logical conclusion of 50 years of evidence. That defensive firepower had made decisive offensive action almost impossible without revolutionary new tactics or weapons. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 should have settled the matter. This conflict, fought in Manchuria between two modern armies equipped with magazine rifles, machine guns and quick-firing artillery, demonstrated everything that the Civil War and Franco-Prussian War had shown. Japanese infantry attacking Russian positions at Port Arthur, Mukden, and dozens of smaller battles suffered catastrophic casualties. Casualty ratios frequently exceeded 3-1 in favour of the defender. At the Battle of Mukden in March 1905, the largest land battle fought up to that time, Japanese forces suffered 71,000 casualties to capture Russian positions defended by troops who took 89,000 casualties. But the Russians inflicted most of their casualties while defending prepared positions. When they attempted counterattacks, they were slaughtered. The battle demonstrated that modern firepower made offensive action incredibly costly even when successful. European military observers watched the Russo-Japanese War closely. Their conclusions varied wildly. Some recognized that modern warfare had become a siege operation writ large, with attacking forces needing massive superiority in numbers and firepower to overcome entrenched defenders. Others dismissed the results as evidence of Asian incompetence or unique terrain conditions. French observers particularly tended to argue that European élan would produce different results. One French observer, Captain Henry Mordac, wrote after watching Japanese attacks at Port Arthur, "The Japanese demonstrate the importance of offensive spirit. Despite heavy casualties, they maintained their attacks until successful. This proves that determined infantry can overcome defensive fire." This was exactly backwards. The Japanese succeeded despite horrific casualties because they had numerical superiority and were willing to accept losses that would have destroyed European armies politically. But Mordac's interpretation became influential in French military thinking. British observers drew different lessons. British officers noted that Japanese success came from careful preparation, massive artillery bombardments, night attacks and infiltration tactics, not from frontal daylight assaults. But British conclusions didn't influence French doctrine, and France's strategic position dominated French military thinking. The French army, convinced it would need to attack to recover Alsace-Lorraine, built its entire doctrine around offensive action. German military thinking evolved differently. The Germans, having won decisively in 1866 and 1870 through superior organisation and firepower, focused on maximising these advantages. German doctrine emphasised careful preparation, coordination between infantry and artillery, and using manoeuvre to create favourable tactical situations rather than relying on frontal assault. German infantry regulations stressed the importance of cover, fire superiority before advancing, and infiltration by small units rather than mass formations. But even German doctrine underestimated defensive firepower's impact. German war plans, particularly the Schlieffen Plan for invading France, assumed that properly organised offensives could achieve decisive results in weeks. The plan called for sweeping through Belgium and northern France, enveloping Paris, and destroying the French army before Russia could fully mobilise. This required offensive operations on a massive scale succeeding quickly, despite the defensive advantages that modern weapons provided. The British Army, smallest of the major European powers but with extensive colonial experience, developed the most realistic appreciation of modern firepower. British doctrine emphasised marksmanship, taking advantage of cover, and coordinated infantry-artillery action. British infantry were trained to shoot rapidly and accurately. 15 aimed rounds per minute was the standard expected of British regulars. But Britain's small army meant its doctrine had limited influence on European thinking. What all armies failed to fully appreciate was how cumulative improvements in weapons technology since the 1860s had made defensive firepower even more overwhelming. The rifles of 1914 weren't Minié ball muzzle loaders. They were magazine-fed bolt-action rifles firing smokeless powder cartridges with effective ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. A trained rifleman could fire 15 to 20 aimed shots per minute, and the bullets flew flat and fast enough to make long-range shooting practical. Machine guns had evolved from temperamental, jam-prone weapons to reliable, devastating tools. The Maxim gun and its derivatives could fire 450 to 600 rounds per minute with reasonable reliability. A single machine gun, properly positioned and supplied with ammunition, could deliver the firepower of 40 to 80 riflemen. German defensive doctrine by 1914 called for machine guns positioned in depth, mutually supporting, with interlocking fields of fire. This created kill zones that infantry couldn't cross without suffering catastrophic losses. Artillery had become more lethal. Quick-firing guns with hydraulic recoil systems could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute accurately, to ranges exceeding 5 miles. High-explosive shells replaced solid shot, creating larger casualty radii. Shrapnel shells, designed to burst above ground and rain metal balls downward, were particularly effective against infantry in the open. An artillery barrage could turn advancing infantry formations into casualty-strewn landscapes in minutes. But attacking forces in 1914 lacked the tools to suppress this firepower effectively. Artillery could bombard defensive positions, but defenders could shelter in trenches and dugouts until the bombardment lifted, then man their positions before attacking infantry arrived. Attackers had no way to destroy machine gun positions that weren't visible until they opened fire. Infantry had no portable weapons that could suppress enemy fire at long range. Smokescreens, infiltration tactics, armoured vehicles, all the tools that would eventually help break the stalemate, didn't exist in practical form in 1914. The Minié Ball's legacy in 1914 was this: every weapon had evolved to be more lethal, but defensive weapons had improved more than offensive weapons. A defender in a trench with a magazine rifle and machine gun support could kill attackers at ranges exceeding half a mile. An attacker advancing across open ground had to close that half mile under fire before being able to fight effectively. The mathematics remained as brutal as they had been at Fredericksburg or Cold Harbor, only more so. When World War I began in August 1914, commanders on both sides expected a war of movement and decisive battles. They got neither. The Western Front, after initial manoeuvres, settled into a continuous trench line from Switzerland to the North Sea. For the next 4 years, millions of men lived in these trenches, and millions died trying to break through them. The First Battle of the Marne in September 1914 stopped the German advance but didn't break the German army. Both sides tried to outflank each other northward in the race to the sea, but the advantage of defensive firepower meant that wherever armies met, they quickly dug in. By November 1914, continuous trench lines stretched across France and Belgium. The war of movement was over, the siege had begun. French offensive doctrine collided with reality in 1914 and 1915 with catastrophic results. French infantry, wearing bright blue coats and red trousers that made them highly visible, attacked German positions in dense formations. German machine gunners described it as target practice. French casualties in the first 5 months of war exceeded 900,000 men, roughly half the trained soldiers France had mobilized. Entire classes from Saint-Cyr, the French military academy, were wiped out in single attacks. The Second Battle of Champagne in September 1915 exemplified the futility. French forces, after massive artillery preparation, attacked German trenches across a 15-mile front. The initial assault captured German forward trenches, but German defenders fell back to secondary positions and stopped the French advance with machine gun fire. French forces suffered 145,000 casualties for gains measured in hundreds of yards. The casualty ratio slightly favoured the French for once, roughly 1.2 to 1, but only because German counterattacks also suffered heavy losses. British forces learned the same lessons at different battles. The Battle of Loos in September 1915 saw British infantry attack across open ground toward German positions. British commanders released poison gas to support the attack, but wind conditions were poor, and much of the gas blew back over British positions. When British infantry advanced, German machine gunners, protected by gas masks and sheltered in deep dugouts, emerged and opened fire. British casualties exceeded 50,000 in 3 days. Territorial gains were negligible. The Battle of the Somme in July 1916 became the definitive demonstration of defensive firepower's dominance. British commanders planned the most massive offensive yet attempted. Over 500 artillery pieces fired 1.7 million shells over 7 days, attempting to destroy German defences. British infantry was told that the bombardment would destroy German positions, and that their advance would be essentially unopposed. This was catastrophically wrong. German defenders sheltered in deep dugouts, some 30 feet underground, that survived the bombardment. The artillery destroyed barbed wire in some areas, but created impassable cratered moonscapes in others. When the bombardment lifted at 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, German machine gunners emerged from their dugouts, set up their weapons, and watched British infantry advancing in waves across no man's land. What happened next was mass slaughter on an industrial scale. German machine gunners fired continuously into British formations advancing at walking pace across open ground. British soldiers, laden with 60 pounds of equipment and ordered to maintain formation, couldn't run, couldn't take cover, couldn't do anything except continue forward into the machine gun fire. In some sectors, entire battalions were wiped out in the first minutes. The Newfoundland Regiment attacked at Beaumont Hamel. Of 801 men who went over the top, 710 were casualties within 30 minutes. The regiment essentially ceased to exist. The 1st Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers lost 500 of 720 men in the first hour. The 10th West Yorkshire Regiment lost 710 of 800 men. These weren't exceptions, they were typical results all along the British line. By the end of July 1st, 1916, British forces had suffered 57 virailleurs, 470 casualties, including 19,840 dead. It remains the bloodiest day in British military history. Territorial gains were minimal, measured in hundreds of yards in most sectors. The Somme offensive continued until November, with British and French forces suffering 620,000 casualties, and German forces suffering approximately 450,000 casualties. The deepest penetration was 7 miles. French experiences at Verdun, fought simultaneously with the Somme, were equally horrific. The German offensive at Verdun aimed to bleed France white by attacking a position the French couldn't abandon. The battle lasted from February to December 1916. Combined casualties exceeded 700,000 men. The front line barely moved. Artillery fired 40 million shells during the battle. The landscape was transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Entire villages ceased to exist, their locations marked only by the names on maps. Veterans of Verdun described conditions that sound like hell. constant artillery fire, no shelter except shell holes, bodies everywhere in various states of decay, no clean water, sporadic food, random death from shells, bullets, or poison gas. Soldiers rotated through Verdun every few weeks because longer exposure caused mental breakdown. The French developed a system of rotating entire divisions through the battle to spread the trauma across the army. These weren't battles in the traditional sense. They were attritional campaigns where victory went to whoever could sustain casualties longer. The Minié Ball's legacy had evolved into industrial-scale slaughter. Armies fed men into meat grinders, hoping to break the enemy's will before their own will broke. Tactical skill mattered less than industrial capacity and population size. Germany, outnumbered and fighting on multiple fronts, was slowly being ground down through sheer attrition. But even as millions died, military thinking evolved slowly. Commanders recognized that frontal assaults were costly but saw no alternative. The continuous trench lines prevented flanking maneuvers. Defensive positions were too strong for infantry alone to overcome. Artillery could destroy forward positions but couldn't maintain suppression long enough for infantry to close and consolidate gains. Every attack followed the same pattern: massive bombardment, infantry assault, initial success, German counterattack, return to starting positions, horrific casualties on both sides. Some innovations appeared. The creeping barrage, where artillery fire advanced ahead of attacking infantry, helped suppress defenders during the approach. Infiltration tactics developed by the Germans used small groups of elite stormtroopers to bypass strongpoints rather than assaulting them directly. Poison gas created casualties and forced defenders to wear masks that reduced effectiveness. Flamethrowers could clear trenches and bunkers, but none of these fundamentally solved the problem of defensive firepower. The solution, when it emerged, came from technology. Tanks, armoured vehicles that could cross trenches and withstand machine gun fire could suppress defensive positions while protecting attacking infantry. Aircraft could spot enemy positions and direct artillery fire accurately. Improved radios allowed better coordination. Sophisticated artillery techniques using predicted fire rather than observed fire allowed surprise bombardments. Combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft, could overwhelm defences. But these developments came slowly, and millions died while armies learned. The Battle of Cambrai in November 1917 demonstrated tanks' potential when British forces used 476 tanks to achieve surprise and break through German lines. But the breakthrough couldn't be exploited because infantry couldn't keep pace, and tanks were too unreliable mechanically to sustain operations. German counterattacks recovered most lost ground. By 1918, armies had finally developed tactics and tools to overcome defensive firepower. The German spring offensives of 1918 used infiltration tactics, gas and surprise bombardments to achieve dramatic breakthroughs. Allied forces responded with coordinated combined arms tactics that eventually stopped the German advance and began the 100 Days Offensive that ended the war. But these developments came after 4 years and millions of casualties. The total cost was staggering. Roughly 10 million soldiers died in World War I, perhaps 20 million were wounded. These casualties resulted largely from the same problem the Minié Ball had created in the 1860s. Defensive firepower exceeded offensive capabilities. Attackers were slaughtered trying to cross the beaten zone, the area covered by defensive fire, to reach enemy positions. The scale was larger, the weapons more sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic was identical to Fredericksburg or Cold Harbor. After the war, military theorists tried to understand what had happened. Some concluded that defensive warfare was inherently superior and that future wars would be fought from prepared positions. The French built the Maginot Line, a system of fortifications along the German border, based on this reasoning. Others concluded that mobility and surprise were essential and that static warfare must be avoided at all costs. The Germans developed blitzkrieg tactics emphasizing rapid mechanized warfare. Both conclusions missed the deeper lesson. The Minié Ball and its descendants had created a permanent problem in warfare. Defensive firepower would always have advantages over attacking forces. Technology could temporarily shift the balance, as tanks and aircraft did in World War II, but defenders would adapt. Anti-tank weapons, improved fortifications, and defensive combined arms tactics restored balance. The problem wasn't solved. It was managed through continuous technological and tactical innovation. World War II demonstrated this. Early German successes came from using mobility and combined arms to avoid fighting the kind of attritional battles that dominated World War I. But when campaigns bogged down, the old dynamics reasserted themselves. The Eastern Front saw millions of casualties from the same causes that killed soldiers in 1914 to 1918. Infantry attacking prepared positions suffered disproportionate casualties. Defensive firepower, enhanced by better weapons, remained deadly. The Pacific War showed similar patterns. American forces attacking Japanese defensive positions on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa suffered heavy casualties, despite having overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. Japanese defenders in prepared positions could inflict 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 casualty ratios until overcome through sustained firepower and methodical reduction. The dynamics were different in scale and technology, but fundamentally similar to Civil War siege operations. Korea and Vietnam reinforced the lessons. Infantry attacking prepared positions suffered heavy casualties. Defensive firepower, whether from machine guns, artillery, or modern automatic rifles, remained deadly. Attackers needed overwhelming advantages in firepower and numbers to succeed. The specific weapons changed, but the underlying mathematics of defensive advantage persisted. Modern warfare continues to grapple with the problem. Precision-guided munitions, drones, electronic warfare, and other advanced technologies provide attacking forces with tools earlier armies lacked. But defenders adapt. Dispersal, camouflage, deception, and mobile defense reduce the effectiveness of precision weapons. The advantage has shifted back and forth repeatedly, but the fundamental challenge remains. The lesson of the Minié ball extends beyond specific battles or even specific wars. It demonstrated how technological change can render accumulated military wisdom obsolete overnight. Tactics and doctrine that worked for generations became suicidal when weapons improved. Armies led by experienced officers using proven methods suffered catastrophic defeats because their experience was based on obsolete technology. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The machine gun made cavalry charges suicidal. Barbed wire stopped infantry charges. Tanks broke through trench lines. Anti-tank weapons stopped tanks. Precision-guided missiles challenged naval supremacy. Each innovation forced tactical and operational adaptation. Armies that adapted quickly gained temporary advantages. Armies that clung to traditional methods suffered disproportionate casualties. But adaptation is difficult. Military institutions are inherently conservative. They train officers over decades, inculcating specific doctrines and methods. Changing these requires not just recognizing that technology has changed, but overcoming institutional inertia, career incentives that reward conformity, and the natural human tendency to believe that experience gained through hard-won combat must retain value. The American Civil War should have taught European armies that rifled weapons made Napoleonic tactics obsolete. Some lessons were learned, but not enough. The Russo-Japanese War should have demonstrated that modern firepower made frontal assaults catastrophically costly. Some officers understood this, but institutional doctrine didn't change enough. World War I killed millions teaching lessons that should have been learned 50 years earlier. Why did armies fail to adapt? Part of the answer is that defense-dominant warfare creates strategic problems. A purely defensive strategy cedes initiative to the enemy. In an era of nationalism and mass mobilization, no major power could accept a purely defensive posture. France needed to attack to recover Alsace-Lorraine and prevent Germany from choosing when and where to fight. Germany needed to attack to avoid fighting a two-front war against France and Russia simultaneously. Russia needed to support Serbia and maintain its great power status. Strategic imperatives forced armies to attack even when tactical conditions made attacks suicidal. Another factor is that military culture values offensive action. Soldiers are taught that taking ground, closing with the enemy, and decisive action define military virtue. Defensive fighting, sitting in trenches and waiting for the enemy to attack, seems passive and unheroic. This cultural bias toward offensive action persisted even when tactical reality made attacks futile. French military culture particularly emphasized offensive spirit as essential to French national character. Accepting that defensive warfare was superior seemed like accepting French inferiority. Technological optimism also played a role. Each generation of officers believed that new weapons would solve the defensive firepower problem. In the 1890s, some believed quick-firing artillery would suppress defensive fire. In the 1900s, some believed improved training and tactics would overcome firepower. In 1914, some believed that initial offensives would break through before defensive positions solidified. In 1916, some believed that massive artillery bombardments would destroy defences. Each belief proved wrong, but hope persisted that the next innovation would be decisive. The truth is that the Minié ball exposed a fundamental problem in warfare that remains unsolved. How do attacking forces overcome prepared defenders with modern weapons? Temporary solutions exist. Surprise can work once, but becomes harder to achieve as defenders adapt. Overwhelming firepower can work, but requires massive resource expenditure and causes widespread destruction. Mobility can avoid strong defences but requires terrain and logistical conditions that don't always exist. Technological superiority can work, but only until the enemy acquires similar technology or develops countermeasures. There is no permanent solution because warfare is competitive. Every innovation in offensive tactics or technology prompts defensive innovation. Tanks initially overcame trenches, but anti-tank weapons eventually stopped tanks. Aircraft supported ground operations, but anti-aircraft weapons challenged air superiority. Precision munitions promised decisive strikes, but dispersal and deception reduced their effectiveness. The cycle continues endlessly. The Minié ball's ultimate legacy is this. It demonstrated that technological change can fundamentally alter warfare faster than military institutions can adapt. It showed that experience and tradition become liabilities when conditions change. It proved that the side with better weapons and better understanding of how technology affects tactics will defeat the side with greater courage and experience but obsolete methods. These lessons have been demonstrated repeatedly in every major conflict since 1850, yet each generation seems to relearn them at terrible cost. At Arlington National Cemetery, thousands of headstones mark graves of soldiers killed in America's wars. Many died in combat whose fundamental dynamics were established when the Minié ball made rifles practical for mass infantry use. A soldier killed at Cold Harbor in 1864 trying to cross 400 yards of open ground under rifle fire faced essentially the same tactical problem as a soldier killed on the Somme in 1916 trying to cross 200 yards of open ground under machine gun fire, or a soldier killed in Korea in 1951 trying to assault a ridge defended by automatic weapons. The weapons evolved. The tactics evolved. The scale changed. But the underlying problem, that defenders with modern weapons can kill attackers at ranges that make closing to effective assault range extremely costly, remains. The Minié ball didn't create this problem. Technological progress in weapons always tends to favour defence over offence, because defensive positions allow better use of weapons' maximum effective range. But the Minié ball was the first weapon that made this dynamic undeniable, and forced armies to confront it. The 19th century began with warfare that Napoleon would have recognised. Dense formations, close-range firefights, cavalry charges, artillery firing solid shot at visible targets. The 20th century began with warfare that would have been familiar to soldiers from World War I. Trenches, long-range rifle fire, machine guns, indirect artillery fire. The transition occurred primarily because of the Minié ball and the tactical revolution it forced. Captain Claude-Étienne Minié died in 1879, relatively obscure despite his invention's impact. He received some recognition during his lifetime but never gained the fame of military commanders or political leaders. Yet his invention changed warfare more profoundly than the decisions of most generals or the strategies of most politicians. A simple, hollow bullet forced armies to abandon tactics that had worked for 2 centuries and learn new methods through trial, error, and massive casualties. The Minié ball proved that sometimes the smallest changes have the largest consequences. A bullet shape that improved rifle loading speed by a few seconds per shot eliminated the tactical validity of every infantry formation and manoeuvre that armies had developed since gunpowder weapons became dominant. The ripples from this change spread through decades and killed millions. They continue spreading today as modern military forces grapple with how to conduct offensive operations against defenders with precision weapons, drones, and guided missiles. The hollow base that expanded when fired, allowing a rifle to load as quickly as a musket while shooting accurately at long range, wasn't just a clever engineering solution. It was a revolution in warfare disguised as a minor technical improvement, and like many revolutions, its full implications weren't understood until long after the change occurred. The Minié Bull made Napoleonic tactics obsolete the moment it was adopted, but armies needed decades and millions of casualties to fully accept this reality. That's the final lesson. Recognizing that fundamental changes occurred is harder than it seems. The comfortable familiarity of traditional methods, the career investment in mastering current doctrine, the institutional inertia of large organizations, and the genuine difficulty of imagining warfare fought in completely different ways all combine to slow adaptation. By the time the necessary changes are fully implemented, conditions may have changed again, requiring new adaptations. The Minié Bull's story is ultimately about the difficulty of adaptation in the face of technological change. It's a lesson that extends far beyond military history to any field where technology affects practice. But in warfare, the cost of failing to adapt isn't just inefficiency or competitive disadvantage, it's mass death. The hundreds of thousands killed in the Civil War, the millions killed in World War I, all died in part because military institutions couldn't or wouldn't adapt fast enough to the changes the Minié Bull initiated.